How do you know when you need a rest? Well, some of you are thinking, oh, I know. Probably, maybe you're looking forward to tomorrow's break from some of the things that you would normally do in a regular week. Maybe, though, you're a person that you need to be forced to take a break. And so, how do you know when you need a rest? Well, when the only time you have that you're alone is in the bathroom, you know that you need a rest. When it takes you an hour to fall asleep at night because your mind is racing because of all the things that you didn't get done that day, you know that you probably need a break. When you go to check your email and you're still checking your email an hour later. When you can't remember anything you've eaten for the past 3 days. Or when you drive for an hour and you've got so much on your mind that when you get there, you have no idea how you got there. When you do not know what day it is, you need a rest. When you actually cannot remember the last time you sat down at the table to eat breakfast. Or when you tweet during a movie, text during dinner, read email during meetings and classes, and then you learn about your spouse's day on Facebook. You know that's when you need a rest. Well, I don't know about you, but sometimes that's all I can hope for, is just a little bit of rest. And that is a major theme from the chapter we're in tonight, Hebrews chapter 4. But the word rest may not mean the same thing that automatically comes to mind as it does for you, for the Hebrew writer. The word rest we saw back in chapter 3. We saw it in verse 11 and in verse 18 regarding the Israelites not entering the promised land, the promised rest of God for them. But now he draws that parallel between them and the Hebrew Christians who are not going to enter God's rest, the even greater rest that he has planned for them if they fall away. So, of course, Israel's example is that they failed to enter their rest because of unbelief. And you'll remember we said that unbelief is the same thing as disobedience. So their unbelief and disobedience kept them out of God's rest. But the writer of Hebrews' point is God's rest is still available. God's rest is still assured to those who remain faithful. So he's pleading with them to continue to be faithful to God so that they can enter that rest. So let me just ask you, in the outset of this study, we'll probably get through about verse 10 tonight. Maybe you've already read through chapter 4. What point is being made about rest? What do you think is, why is this a key theme here in this chapter? And what is he trying to say with the idea of rest?
Well, to the Hebrews, obviously, it was a reference to that first group that didn't get into the rest. And they had to wait 40 years. And even then, it wasn't a rest for them because they had to fight their way through.
Yeah.
For us, that rest is the anticipation of being with God forever.
Yeah, the anticipation of being with God forever. That's good. What else? Any other thoughts on that idea?
Jesus said, in this world you will have tribulation. I think it's a constant struggle that every generation has to endure. And I think that's kind of what he's picturing here for us. You're going to reach a time and a place where you're not going to fight that battle anymore.
We're not going to have to fight the battle of persecution and the unjust realities of our world. Okay. Any other thoughts? All right, well, let's start in verse 1, Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 1. Therefore, of course, therefore, of all the things we studied in chapter 3, therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear, lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. So we see the first sort of phrase here, a promise remains. While the promise or the promise that is still there implies that whatever that promise is has not come to its fulfillment, but it is continual. It is something that remains for God's people. And of course, it's more important than the rest that he's comparing to from the Israelites that was promised to the Jews. But what is his rest? Well, his rest is, we could think about that as provided in lots of ways. while we live, while we're on earth. But ultimately, he's not talking about anything physical. He's not talking about something that we can achieve by sleeping or taking a nap, no physical ways of rest. Ultimately, it's the rest, as John brought out, this idea of being with God for eternity. He's talking about heaven, and it's similar to what we're going to find over in chapter 9. Look over there for just a sneak peek. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 15. Hebrews 9 and verse 15. Therefore he, Jesus, is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. So in this instance, he's talking about our eternal rest as something that we will inherit, but obviously the theme remains that there's an eternal rest to be provided. And so his point is, it is still available. It's still there, and it is something of God, lest we fail to attain it. If we're not careful, we're not going to have it. And he says, so be afraid of that. Let us fear, lest any should seem to have failed to reach it. There are a lot of things that we should not be afraid of, right? As Christians, even though persecution is a reality, that ought to not keep us from doing what we do. We really ought to not be afraid of physical danger or sickness, really. COVID should not be an extreme fear in our life. Death, anything that leads to death, those things ought to not be real fears for us in our life. And so being Christians changes what we're afraid of. But this right here is something worth being afraid of. This is something worthy of our fear. If we fail to reach God's rest, that's something worth having some fear about. And so he says, let us fear, lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. If we fail that, if we fail to reach God's rest, nothing else will have mattered. Nothing else will matter if we fail to reach God's rest. And so that should be our biggest fear in this life. So just as the Israelites fell short of reaching the promised land, he's bringing them up to say, that might happen to you if you keep going down this path, Hebrew Christians. And of course, that might happen to us if we fail to continue on God's path as well, if we fall short of what is promised. Verse 2, for good news came to us, just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. So interesting enough, we have in verse 2 something we talked about this morning. We talked about this morning the idea of gospel, the idea of good news, and that it's not really to be thought of as a set of instructions. It's really not a blueprint or a manual about how to get to heaven. It's a message. It's a story of good tidings, of good news. And he brings up this idea, for good news came to us as it did to them. So it's not just always good news about Jesus. He's reminding them that there was some good news for the Israelites. What was that? What was the good news for the Israelites? Well, we could notice, just for an example, Exodus chapter 6. Here, the Bible reads, God says, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. And then I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And then I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. See, that was the good news of the Israelites, that God is going to take them out of their terrible situation, that he's going to be their God, and they are going to be his people, and then he's going to give them a better situation, a better land, the rest, the promised land. And so to the Israelites, the gospel didn't have any connection to Jesus. It had to do with this amazing deliverance out of Egypt and receiving the promised land. But to Christians, as he compares that, it is Jesus. It is Christianity. It is the church. It is heaven. It is the kingdom. It is all of the things that the gospel brings to the reality under this beautiful and better new covenant that he'll continue to explain throughout this letter to the Hebrews. So the good news itself cannot do anything. The good news cannot help anyone who doesn't act on it. And that's why he uses this phrase, they heard it, but it did not benefit them. It didn't help the Israelites. They had some great news. It was such wonderful news, but it didn't do anything for them. It did not profit them. It was not beneficial to them. And so the message was worthless because it was not combined with their action, with their faith. The gospel did not help them because of their unbelief, as he talked about back in chapter 3, and their lack of unfaltering faith shown through obedient works. So what does that have to do with us? How is he bringing that into our realm? John?
Well, I want to go back and compare what you just went through to let us fear, lest any of you be judged.
Please.
Any of you are Hebrew Christians. They're kind of a double positive here. And even though they were Hebrews, that doesn't guarantee their salvation.
Right.
Lest any of you implies that they could lose their salvation.
Right.
And it's a great argument against our folks that have faith only.
Certainly.
But this is what he says here is emphasized in that second verse. There is good news, but there are conditions.
Yeah, and you could not meet those conditions and therefore fail. Yeah, great. Any other thoughts? So what he says in verse 2, the fact that the good news for the Israelites did not benefit them. Let that really sink in. The good news, the gospel, the thing that was meant to save them didn't. It didn't benefit them. It did not do anything for them. Now, it's the same for us under the New Testament gospel. He says, for the good news came to us just as it did to them. But the message for them that they heard did not benefit them because they were united by faith with those who listened. So in the same way, he's saying the same thing could happen. Who cares how great the news is if you aren't interested in doing anything about it? There's got to be the other half of that. Our good news, of course, is 100 times better than their good news, and many are still not doing anything about it. He's saying you're not connecting your faith to it. You're not uniting your faith with the gospel, with the good news. So how might that hit home today? Well, if you're a person, let's say, a Christian who always comes to every worship service and every Bible class, and you're at every gospel meeting, and you think that that's pretty much all that you need to be doing, you're a person that probably needs to consider what's being said. You can hear the good news all day long, 2 or 3 times on Sunday, once on Wednesday, maybe 5 times a week if you come to a gospel meeting. You can hear it all day long, but it does you no good if that's where it ends, if that's what the end all is for you. John, were you going to say something?
As you say, the hearing has to be met with faith.
That's right. The hearing must be met with faith. It has to be united by faith, there in verse 2. And so you can hear it, but it does no good until it's met with faith. And the moment, by the way, just because you started doing something about it, the moment you quit doing something about it is also the moment that you give up that gospel. You give up the benefit it is for you and the effectiveness that it is for you. This is a rough quote from something I heard from Wesley Walker at the True Ministry Conference last weekend. We are too overly educated and too underworked. And I had to really let that sink in for myself when he said that. But think about it, really. I mean, do we not know enough? I mean, we know, we ought to learn, we ought to continue to grow. That's not the point. But do we not No. And sometimes we think that is all there is to what we're doing as Christians. That we keep coming, we keep learning, and somehow it's just that's it. That we're gonna be what we ought to be. But really, I thought that was pretty accurate, that too many are just too overly educated and not enough are doing anything about what they're hearing and what they're learning. And so he said that in a study of James, which of course makes that even clearer, because the whole point of the gospel in James is to act, right? James 1:22, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. The reality is the average Christian gets plenty of the good news. We ought to hear it enough. In fact, way too much, to the point that we think that's all we're supposed to be doing. That is our end goal by hearing it over and over and over again. And somehow, maybe by hearing it too much, that's what keeps us from doing it, I wonder. So we've sort of substituted hearing for the doing part. So part of that obviously falls on those of us in certain positions. Those of us who preach the gospel need to be the exhorters of Christians and show how to do what we're telling to do. Elders need to set up situations and opportunities to act on the things that we're taught and the things that we learn. But also, if you pay attention, there are lots of opportunities. And so I think the point is we hear as a substitute for the action. So for instance, some things going on right now. Maybe you've heard them, but haven't considered taking part in them. This Tuesday would be a great opportunity that we're going to meet at 6:30. We're going to send out some flyers in the mail, go knock some doors, and invite people to our gospel meeting. That's something that we need to do. We need to act on as Christians and take part of. We need to be inviting people that we know to that gospel meeting, whether that's your neighbors, your coworkers, family, friends. If you use Facebook or you can make calls, those are the kind of things that we need to be doing as Christians. You need to be studying the Bible with somebody. You need to be actively sharing the good news. Anybody, and even if it's not a non-Christian, if you're not ready for that, you could practice. Pick somebody that is a Christian and practice. Learn how to become a sharer of the good news. If you're a man, you've probably heard it announced, we've got a workshop in Manford this coming weekend. You need to be a part of that, not just to go and hear some more and learn some more, but to get good ideas to go then and act, right? That's what those types of conferences are for. If nothing else, go talk to your elders, that they will tell you ways that you can get involved. You need to come and talk to me or talk to Todd, because we've got Lads to Leaders coming up, and you can get involved with that. We'll be starting that very, very soon. Building maintenance projects need to be done. Members have fallen away. They need to be reached out to. Visitors who have come here before, they need to be reached out to. There are things, a plethora of things that need to be done. And so coming and sitting and hearing is good, and we need to do that, but that's not all. That's not all we're supposed to be doing. And I think that's the warning here. The Israelites heard the good news, but then they just sat on it. It didn't do anything for them, and therefore it was no benefit to them. So we are supposed to be doing something based on the good news that we are told. Any other thoughts through verse 2? Shirley.
I agree with everything that you're saying so far. Well, 2 months ago, you had us, pick up those cards.
Yeah.
There.
Right.
I kept every last one of them I sent. The date and everything. Didn't get no response. Mm-hmm. And then I called the black couples over here.
Yeah.
Okay. I called them, and I wrote them a letter, and they could place a membership with us and everything. And I said, when will y'all be back? He said, we will not be back. He said, baptized and everything. So what else are you supposed to do?
That's a really good question. Let's explore that for a second. I mean, if we are acting on our faith and we're reaching out and we're doing these things, but we hit roadblocks, what are some ways that can help us get through those roadblocks? Any thoughts? John?
Encouragement. Just keep doing it. Keep involved with it.
Sometimes I don't answer the phone.
Right. Right. So John says keep doing it. So sometimes we hit those roadblocks. Obviously, things happen. People don't respond the way they ought to. We're trying, we're doing our best, and we're just getting nothing. Well, that's difficult, but no reason to stop. We'll either keep trying with them, yes, but move on to somebody else, maybe who would be more receptive. So that's a great thought. Just keep trying. Stay with it. Be encouraged. Any other thoughts? Ways to push through?
Also, look around, your congregation. Maybe encourage others that, that are trying to reach out.
Yeah.
They're actually hearing,
Encourage the ones that are encouraging, because they need encouraged too. Yeah.
I had somebody that I don't even know how many times I reached out.
Mm-hmm.
And, they told me last my song that, thank you for that. It really is doing good. To hear, so even though they never responded,
Right.
that was almost encouraging that, maybe what I do.
So you may not always see the benefit of the things that you're doing and encouraging them, but it's working. And so sometimes it's hard to tell that you're doing any good. That's a great point. Other thoughts on trying to get through some of these difficulties, roadblocks? Darcy?
We need to also understand that we can't physically make somebody do something.
Right.
That's not our job, to physically make them do
Right.
something. We have to understand that. That's hard to understand.
Well, and remember, this came up in the previous chapter. Go back to verses 12 and 13. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil and unbelieving heart. We said that the first key to that, to not falling away, is check yourself, right? Make sure that you are where you need to be. Now, once you've done that, he moves on to say, but exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. So then we need to reach out. We need to exhort one another. Sometimes that looks like a card. Sometimes that looks like a call. Sometimes that's gets a little bit stronger and says, hey, brother, you are living in sin. You're falling away. We need to exhort and strongly encourage. But at the same time, as Darcy's saying, you can't make somebody be where they're supposed to be. You can't make somebody obey what they're supposed to be obeying. And so we also need to remember that, a great point, that we can't put somebody physically in the place that they need to be in their life, that maybe they have become hardened. Maybe they have just decided not to obey. And then at verse 14, we also said we just need to endure. For we have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original confidence firm to the end. And so I really appreciate what you're saying, Shirley, because that is the reality. I think we do all the things that we do, and we just hit roadblocks. We have negative experiences.
Sometimes it makes you like, I'm just saying, sometimes I think you might have set a good example for them too. You never know about that.
Maybe you've done something to set a negative example. Yeah.
But you don't offend everybody.
Right. And of course, that's not our goal. We don't want to tiptoe and make sure we're not offending anybody. Sometimes we just will. And so we need to push through is really what verse 14 is about. Oh, Don.
I think we all know more than we do. And we hear more than we know. We get a lot of hearing.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean we're learning. We're just talking right now. We're hearing all we do.
Right.
It's processing along with COVID-19, things going on in our world, what our kids are doing. So that doesn't mean we're learning anything.
Right.
It just means that we're hearing. So I think we all hear more than we know, and we don't do all that we know. But I think it'd be a mistake for us to get the impression that if we just know enough and do enough, that we'll be all right. We're not going to be redeemed or sanctified how much we do. We'll never do enough. It's not an encouragement to slack off anything.
Right.
But it's also a reminder that we're not redeemed by our good work.
Yes, so no amount of knowledge or action will save us. Those things will not redeem us, certainly. Any other thoughts? Let's go into verse 3, Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 3. For we who have believed enter that rest. As he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. This is where it gets really, really interesting on the topic of rest. God ceased his work of creating on the seventh day, and he has not created anything since. That's really, we shouldn't get too bogged down in what this idea is, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. That just means he's stopped creating. Now, it's also interesting that he brings up the idea that God rested. He moves into that in verse 4 as well, but God rested. And of course, he intended his rest, as has been talked about through the last couple of chapters. He intended rest for his believers from the day he ceased creation. That's really what's being said. Now remember, Jesus said that too. Matthew 25:34. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. So since the day God stopped creating, he intended for us to enter into his rest. And as well as John 14, remember how Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, and that where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I am going. So we understand that God ceased creating and he rested. That's what he says in verse 4. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way. And God rested on, lost my place, rested on the seventh day from all his works. So what I've come to understand and what I'll pass on to you is the concept of rest obviously is very important in this chapter. But the word rest does not always mean the same thing every time we read it. So there are four ways that the word rest is used in Hebrews 4. Four rests in Hebrews chapter 4. One would be the Sabbath day rest. Two would be God's rest from creating, as we hear in verse 4. The third would be the promised land rest, talking about Canaan, also referred to as Joshua's rest and other places. And then the fourth way we might call David's rest, because remember, he's quoting out of Psalm 95, talking about the eternal rest of heaven. Now, all of those, even though they're sort of different references to rest, refer to the fact that God intends for that rest, has always said that there would be rest, and even though even today there is that rest available to all those who believe and obey. So it really, any time that he uses the word rest, it is a type of what is coming for the Christian. It is an analogy. It's a foreshadowing for what we will experience if we inherit what God intends for us. I don't know if he intends to be facetious or why exactly the writer phrases it like this, but I find it funny. For somewhere he has spoken, as if the readers of this, as if even today as we sit here reading that, don't automatically know what he's talking about. He's talking about Genesis. We know that. We know Genesis chapter 2 referring to God's rest. And so when we read Genesis chapter 2, let's do that real quick, just as a reminder. Genesis chapter 2, this is the certain place he's speaking about. We're told that God rested, right? Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day, made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he has done in creation. So real quick, tell me, what does that mean? Have you thought about that in a while? Have you heard anything about that in a while? Why did God rest? I mean, is he tired? What does that mean? Any thoughts?
He was leading by example to give us the rhythm of life. We're supposed to take time to rest.
Yeah.
We're supposed to appreciate what we've accomplished is rest.
That's good. So verse 3 points to the fact that he sets up that example for us to give us rest. Any other thoughts, John?
Even though he didn't establish the Sabbath as a day of rest until Sinai,
Right.
the concept was still there.
So he established the concept, and then at Sinai, actual Sabbath. Janie?
Well, I heard a preacher say one time that just two kinds of rest. When you mow the lawn, you're all tired and sweaty and you've got to rest.
Mm-hmm.
But like you paint a picture, and it's so pretty to stand there and say, it's that kind of rest. It's not because it's time.
So it's like an appreciation, or how it says it was good and good and good throughout the. Yeah, he just looked back and admired it. Okay. Any other thoughts?
An examination,
An examination. Okay.
just to look back over and be content.
Yeah, to be content, to step back and see what he did. Any other thoughts, Jerry?
I was thinking of it being his final, message, that this is the rest, this is the place for you. I rest my case.
I rest my case. Okay. Yeah. Okay, very good. Don?
Well, I think, the Bible uses a lot of what we call anthropomorphisms, where you use human analogies to talk about God, so you have some kind of a visual concept. And I really think that's what's going on here. It's not that God's creative powers were exhausted by the end of the creation week. I just can't imagine. Nothing is impossible with God.
Right.
I don't think he had to recoup,
Right.
for 24 hours. I think just talking about that was his purpose. He achieved his purpose. And he ceased to do that.
Yes.
And went on to other things. John 5 talks about Jesus said, my Father is working in the now.
Yes.
And I'm working. So I think, there's a sense in which God hadn't just been gold breaking up there for 5,000 years.
Right. Yeah, he didn't stop doing that and then not doing anything else. So the idea of rest is, again, we've got to change sort of our concept of mowing the yard and being tired. This really just means ceasing from. Ceasing from. It's not a physical rest of God. And so with that in mind, what is our rest? Well, again, we've got to change our thinking. If God's rest was not physical, then our rest is not going to be physical. The same concept plays out. It is a ceasing from. So we can think about it like this. Just as God stopped his works and started different works, he stopped his works. We can also think about this rest as no longer doing the works that we now do. We will be stopping our works, the things that we do to encourage others, the things that we should be doing as Christians. All these works that we do will no longer be done, right? Because we won't need to do them. So we'll be ceasing from the things that we do, just as God ceased his work in that sense. We will cease doing the works which he created for us to walk in, Ephesians 2 and verse 10. So which is really just another reminder that we need to be working, because there's going to come a day where that will cease. And of course, as Don said, God just picked up that work and did it in a different way, as Jesus wrote about in John chapter 5. So the Hebrew author uses God's rest to show that, say, for instance, the Sabbath rest was just a taste of what he intended for his people. It was really just a prophetic example of the larger fulfillment. F.F. Bruce writes, God began his rest after creation. He is never said to have completed it. This implies his rest continues still and may be shared by those of faith and obedience. So either way, the Hebrew writer is saying it's open, it's available to those who would take advantage of it. Verse 5, and again in this passage he said, they shall not enter my rest, since therefore it remains, for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience. Again, he appoints a certain day today, saying that through David, so long afterward, in the words already quoted, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. So again, we see the sort of different concepts of rest being played out. Verse 5, we see the ultimate rest. Verses 6 and 7, he goes on to bring up this idea of disobedience, which was very heavily hit on at the end of chapter 3. Disobedience is really a word meaning not persuaded. Not persuaded. So the Israelites did not fall because they did not accept the gospel. They did not accept the facts. They did not fall because they failed to act. They were not persuaded by the things that they heard. And they also defines a certain day as today. And again, just change the way that you automatically think of that word. Really, that word in this case is talking about the age, like Paul uses it in 2 Corinthians 6, verse 2. Now is the acceptable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. So today is the opportunity. And during the Messianic age, during the age of Jesus, is all the time that we're going to have. We will not be able to obey after this era in time. Verses 8 and 9, for if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So real quickly, he takes a jab at Joshua. Well, not really a jab, but he's just saying Joshua is less superior. Jesus is superior because he does something that Joshua could not do. He gave a rest that Joshua could not give. And if Joshua had given them rest, and if Joshua's rest was the final rest, then why would God have used David to speak about it later, 400 years later, in Psalm 95, which he's quoting? So this rest is the needed rest that Jesus talks about. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. John.
There's just emphasis on Joshua. It didn't say Moses. It didn't say one of the other prophets. It said Joshua, the one that led you into the land, couldn't provide you rest because it could have been yours by faith. You'd entered the right way 40 years before. You came in, you had to take the land by force. It was not a time of rest.
Right.
He's saying we're in that same situation of rebellion.
Rebellion.
If we don't put the right things in our place.
Yeah, that's good. And then verse 10, Hebrews 4 and verse 10, for whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. So again, we have different types of rest throughout this chapter. This is not Canaan. It's not Sabbath, because if you think about it, Sabbath rest was followed by what? Another week of work, right? 6 more days of labor. So this is the real genuine rest, which God began on the 7th day and continued. Revelation 14:13 speaks about it like this. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed that they may rest, not physical, but they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. They're ceasing the works that they had been doing. The Sabbath rest, by the way, as you remember, was commanded, but he compares this rest as a rest that is promised. Go back to verse 1. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. Okay, any thoughts through verse 10 and specifically on what do we need to do with this information? What can we learn from Hebrews 4, 1 through 10? Stay faithful. Don't give up. Good.
Faith, action, involvement, activity.
Faith into action, into involvement, activity. Keep going, keep pushing. What else? Any other thoughts that this brings to mind?
Don't let the goal of salvation ever slip from your thinking.
Don't let the ultimate goal slip from your thinking. I just picked out really three things that we could see, starting in verse 1. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear. Let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. I just called that confirm your own salvation. Just take a moment, maybe take the whole week, and just think about really where you are. Think about where you are in the good news. Think about your salvation. Think about where you are in your relationship to God. Take that time that you need to, and fear the fact that you might not be where you need to be. Fear that you would not enter the rest. And then, even though the reality is we cannot do enough work to enter that rest, we need to be working. Verse 6, since therefore it remains for some to enter, those who formerly received the good news failed. Why did they fail? Because of disobedience. So we need to make sure not only that we are learning, not only that we are listening, not only that we are confirming our own salvation, but that we are doing something with what we're being taught. And then ultimately we need to look forward to some rest. Amen. We need to look forward to the day of rest, as he talks about in verses 9 and 10. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has rested from his works as God did from his. Right now we have an opportunity to work. Right now we have work to do, and we need to do it while we can. Looking forward to the day that we won't be doing that work anymore. And so maybe just some things to take home, to think about, to act on, and to be encouraged by this week. All right, we'll have another song.